The story of aviation is, in many ways, the story of humankind's unrelenting dream to rise above the earth. From the earliest visionaries who watched birds wither to the engineers who sketched impossible machines on fragile sheets of paper, to the pioneers who first lifted trembling wings into the sky, every chapter has been built on courage and faith. When a plane takes off today, it is not only the culmination of human invention and scientific precision but also a simple trust placed by passengers in the miracle of flight. People board an aircraft with the expectation that after hours of soaring over oceans and clouds, they will arrive gently at another corner of the world. Yet behind that trust lies a fragile truth: even the safest system can be shaken by unforeseen forces. And sometimes, in the space of a few seconds, disaster nearly arrives, only to be pushed back by resilience, instinct, and chance. When we speak of aviation's near misses, we enter a realm of suspended breath and racing hearts, where the line separating catastrophe from salvation is thinner than a cloud's veil. These are not the disasters that took lives and stained history with sorrow. Instead, they are the moments that, but for a decision, a correction, or a fragment of human grace, could have ended in unimaginable tragedy. Instead of loss, we find relief. Instead of silence from wreckage, we hear applause on a runway. And when we listen closely to these stories, we come to see not only the vulnerabilities of flight but also its profound strength. There is something inherently poetic in the notion of a near miss. It is like listening to a melody that nearly loses its balance only to resolve into harmony again. From within a cabin thousands of feet above the ground, passengers may glance at one another without words, feeling the invisible shiver of danger passing close enough to be felt but mercifully distant enough to be survived. A near miss is a reminder that flying is never entirely routine, even if for millions it has become as ordinary as driving across town. Each of these experiences adds to the tapestry of aviation's resilience, sharpening rules, strengthening designs, and engraving unforgettable lessons that guide the hands and minds of those who carry lives into the skies. To begin, it is important to dwell on the paradox of flight itself. An aircraft is a marvel of physics resting on the delicate balance between lift, thrust, weight, and drag. These forces dance together in constant conversation, orchestrating a balance so precise that even the slightest disruption demands swift correction. Pilots are not merely drivers, they are guardians of equilibrium, interpreters of subtle signs, and decision-makers for hundreds of souls at once. Safety systems hum quietly, sensors whisper streams of information, and air traffic controllers guide from distant towers, like unseen conductors shaping invisible routes. All of it works seamlessly, until one unpredictable moment arrives, a moment that bends the straight path of routine into a sudden question of survival. In tracing these near misses, one cannot ignore the role of chance. Fate seems to weave itself into the fabric of flight. For every story where training and discipline shine, there is also the quiet acknowledgement that timing, weather, or sheer coincidence had a hand in the outcome. Engines are built to withstand immense stress, yet once in a rare while, birds collide at the wrong angle, or turbulence arrives with unexpected ferocity. A gauge flickers, a warning light pulses, a fuel calculation falters. At those instants, the difference between disaster and survival rests in seconds of human response. Yet what perhaps gives these stories their power is not the potential for devastation but the triumph of calm. Time and time again, the world has seen pilots and crew meet chaos with extraordinary focus. It is in these suspended moments, cockpits filled with alarms, cabins holding anxious passengers, that courage becomes tangible, showing its face not as panic but as steady hands and measured voices. Survival does not always come from miracle alone. It comes from years of preparation, endless training, and a quiet inner strength that remains invisible until the moment it is needed. Consider the perspective of a traveler seated by the window, gazing at clouds like drifting seas of white. To them, the flight may seem serene, the cabin calm, the journey ordinary. Yet far away at the front of the aircraft, decisions may be unfolding that determine whether the flight remains ordinary or becomes a tale of survival retold for decades. This divide between what passengers feel and what the cockpit endures is part of what makes near-miss stories so astonishing. By the time the wheels touch the ground and relief bursts into applause, most passengers will never fully know just how close they were to history turning dark. And perhaps that is merciful, for air travel thrives upon the faith of those who fly. The psychology of near misses is worth lingering on. For those who live through them, memories resurface in fragments: a sudden silence of engines, the tilt of the plane, the tone of the captain's voice over the intercom. In those brief encounters, passengers confront the hidden truth of aviation's fragility. And when the landing finally arrives, there is a quiet transformation. Every safe step upon the ground is treasured more deeply. Every ordinary sound of baggage claim becomes a reminder of life's return to routine. Pilots afterward sometimes describe similar reflections, though their calm professionalism often leaves little room for open confession. Yet beneath their discipline lies the knowledge that they faced the void and turned away from it. Aviation's near misses invite us to see flight anew not only as a safe and reliable form of travel but as a shared human endeavor bound by fragility, courage, and trust. They remind us that each successful landing is the result of countless invisible acts: engineers who design with foresight, trainers who rehearse the unimaginable, regulators who adapt lessons into rules, and crews who carry discipline into the skies. Each flight holds not just passengers destined for meetings or vacations, but also the collective effort of generations who refuse to let the dream of flight slip from human grasp. As we step into these stories, it is worth slowing time down. Each account will be told not with urgency but with calm, so that you, as the listener, may follow the faint pulse of danger and then the steady relief that follows. This is not a documentary of disasters but of disasters averted, of tragedies transformed into testaments of resilience. And though every near miss brushes against fear, every outcome described here ends with survival. It is in that survival that we find comfort, assurance, and even gratitude for the fragile wonders of the sky. The skies will always hold uncertainty, for weather shifts, machine strain, and human hands must always guide. Yet for each story where catastrophe came close, thousands more flights passed quietly, carrying people to their lives below without incident. If there is a truth in the study of near misses, it is that their very rarity is what makes them stand out. They are not evidence of danger everywhere, but rather proof of how much discipline and preparation surround the smallest chances of failure. They exist as both warnings and reassurances, balancing between the reality of risk and the triumph of safety. Within the next chapters, we will delve into individual flights, each different yet bound by a common thread: the narrow space between disaster and salvation. Their voices echo across history, reminding us that flight is never taken for granted. Tonight, as we journey through them together, let the rhythm of their telling ease you, for though these stories walk the edge of disaster, every one ends with survival. Each is a memory of fear turned into relief, of chaos turned into calm, and of the skies offering humanity one more chance. What defines the threshold between routine and crisis in the sky is often so subtle that it cannot be measured in absolute terms. To most travelers, a flight consists of simple moments: the lifting away from the runway, the tilt of ascent, the steady hum of engines in cruise, and the eventual descent toward the ground. Yet beneath that simplicity lies an orchestra of precise systems, each constantly monitoring, adjusting, and responding, orchestrated by the human presence at the controls. The beauty and complexity of this machinery mean that when something falls out of rhythm, the disruption can spread like a ripple upon still water. A single missed calculation, a sensor sending unexpected signals, or an unexpected voice crackling over the radio can become the moment when fate begins to lean toward uncertainty. Still, in every account of a near miss, there is something uplifting at work, a resolution that comes not through collapse, but through adaptation. The anatomy of these narrow escapes rests upon an interplay of human and machine, of precision and improvisation, of chance and control. To speak of near misses is to understand the fragility of balance. Aircraft are creations built to handle immense stresses, yet they remain beholden to the limits of nature. Weather is one of the most common invisible sculptors of danger. Turbulence no longer feels like a simple bump in the air once it swells into violent shakes that throw passengers against seat belts and challenge pilots to steady massive wings through chaos. Clouds, which seem innocent from a distance, can hide storms with winds so brutal they can batter even the strongest designs. Ice unseen can form on wings, robbing them of their lift. Lightning crackling across the night sky can threaten sensitive electronics. These forces of nature are not malicious, they are simply vast, indifferent presences, and it is the pilot's art to read, to anticipate, and to respect them. Most flights proceed through weather encounters without issue, yet once in a great while, a combination of factors pushes an aircraft close to the edge, forcing improvisation that transforms the narrative of a flight into survival. Technology itself, despite its refinement, can sometimes falter. The modern airplane is one of the most intricate machines ever devised by humanity. Layers of redundancy protect against failure, yet redundancy is a promise rather than a guarantee. Systems are duplicated and triplicated so that if one piece falters, another will stand in its place. But there are conditions where faults align together in strange, rare convergence. A fuel gauge misreads, a hydraulic line ruptures, a warning light flickers uncertainly. Pilots endure rigorous hours of training so that when the improbable does occur, instinct and procedure will form an answer. The presence of such preparation does not make the near miss less frightening. Instead, it makes the outcome possible. To survive an engine stall or a navigation error is not only testament to luck, but also to lives dedicated to anticipating the unthinkable. Communication, too, becomes part of the anatomy of a near miss. From control towers rising above bustling airports, from radar halls where voices guide the invisible presence of wings, every instruction is crafted with care. Yet language can be imprecise, transmission can falter, and human fatigue can sow errors. History has taught aviation that the misinterpretation of a single phrase can lead two aircraft to converge toward catastrophe. That is why words are weighted with precision, repeated for clarity, standardized so that their rhythm is mechanical and unambiguous. Still, even in the world of structured communication, slips occur. Pilots have faced moments when a misunderstood instruction threatened collision only for vigilance or instinct to prevent disaster. When these narrow margins resolve in safety, one begins to appreciate that clarity is itself a guardian no less essential than metal or fuel. A near miss often unfolds not in a single event but as a cascade. One small issue sparks another, and in quick succession, pressure builds. A captain might notice an engine running hotter than normal. Minutes later, a weather front shifts, rerouting requires new fuel calculations, and distraction lingers inside the cockpit. Suddenly what began as a small mechanical concern has bred a mixture of complexity, where every decision carries amplified consequence. These cascades are why aviation drills exist, why checklists stretch for pages, why training focuses so profoundly on discipline under pressure. What may seem like endless repetition in a simulator is preparation for the single rare moment when every muscle memory and every recalled procedure will decide the fate of hundreds. It is in this crucible that pilot professionalism reveals itself most purely, not in preventing every irregularity, for that is impossible, but in facing them with clarity and calm. There is an irony at play when discussing the nature of near misses. For the passengers, the most miraculous element is often imperceptible. In some scenarios, the person seated by the window overlooking deep clouds does not even realize how close events came to spiraling into tragedy. They may continue reading, watching a film, or drifting toward sleep while, unseen from their vantage point, the pilots above them are threading through a sequence of challenges that could easily have become a headline. They disembark at their destination thinking only of the ordinariness of the journey, unaware that history very nearly tilted in a different direction. In other scenarios, however, passengers are not spared the knowledge of crisis. They witness the shaking of the fuselage, they hear the silence as engines spool down unexpectedly, they notice faces tense around them. For them, the resolution into survival becomes vivid memory, one that years later will rush back through spoken words, retellings, and private reflections. For every near miss studied and recorded, the aviation world builds upon its lessons. Investigators step in after each incident to document every variable, the weather conditions, the dialogue between crew and controllers, the mechanical state of systems, the choices of the pilots. Flight recorders, those indestructible keepers of sounds and data, offer their blunt testimony so that no misunderstanding remains. The reason is clear: each close call holds within it the power to prevent a future disaster. The past is examined not for blame but for understanding, because aviation lives not only on the pillars of science and technology but also on the capacity for humility. Airlines refine checklists, manufacturers strengthen systems, governments issue new regulations, all flowing from the recognition that the shadow of one near miss can become the light of countless safe flights later on. Part of grasping the anatomy of these events means listening to pilots themselves. Their accounts reveal not only what occurred in technical terms but what was felt. Many aviators describe experiencing time in unusual ways during crisis. Seconds seem to stretch, their attention narrows, and instinct takes over. Years of rehearsed scenarios crystallize instantly into decisive action. After the fact, when asked how they knew exactly what to do, they rarely describe it as a single flash of genius. Instead, they recall the hum of training accumulated through years, the reinforcement of countless drills that shaped reflexes. Beneath their calm exterior lies the acceptance of responsibility that is both awe-inspiring and heavy. Every life aboard the aircraft depends upon the clarity of their mind and the steadiness of their hands. Most of the time, this responsibility feels abstract, but in a near miss, it becomes overwhelming, and yet they carry it with grace. Crew members beyond the cockpit also hold essential roles in these unseen dramas. Flight attendants, whose work is often perceived as centered on hospitality, are in truth crucial keepers of safety. In the press of a near miss, their calm voices assure passengers, their swift actions check seatbelts and secure aisles, their training guides potential evacuations. Few outside aviation realize the intensity of preparation these crew undergo for scenarios rarely seen. When passengers look back on their experience of tension in the sky, they often remember the steadiness reflected in the conduct of those who served them. That steadiness is not accidental but cultivated, a core design of aviation safety that extends beyond engines and aerodynamics to the human comfort of discipline under stress. There is also the element of human psychology to consider in the anatomy of a near miss. Fear in the cabin spreads quickly, sharpened by uncertainty. At the same time, reassurance spreads equally fast when calm leadership prevails. The mood of 100 people can pivot upon the tone of a single announcement by the captain. Words chosen matter profoundly. A voice that explains with collected clarity, that acknowledges difficulty without breeding panic, becomes a lifeline for those strapped into narrow seats, unable to affect their fate in any physical way. For many passengers, these words are remembered as the single element that bridged the space between chaos and hope. To tell the story of near misses without acknowledging this psychological tether would be to overlook the invisible dimension of human survival in the sky. It is tempting for the outside observer to frame near misses as brushes with disaster governed primarily by fortune. Indeed, luck does find its way into many accounts, a few hundred feet of clearance during an avoided collision, a sudden clearing in clouds, a runway that appeared just when fuel neared exhaustion. But it does a disservice to those who dedicate their skills to say that survival was only the work of chance. The truth rests in a marriage between preparation and circumstance. Fortune may tilt the balance, but without knowledge, discipline, and courage, luck alone could not land an aircraft when engines fall silent or hydraulics are gone. Aviation as a whole understands this balance deeply, which is why training intensifies continuously, always imagining the next scenario yet unseen. Every near miss is proof not that disaster nearly won, but that human commitment prevented it. Thus, to describe the anatomy of a near miss is to explore layers of physics, nature, machinery, communication, psychology, and chance all converging within a narrow corridor of time. For passengers, the moment may be lived in bewilderment or even ignorance. For pilots and crew, it is etched into memory with the sharpness of lived danger. For investigators, it becomes data and guidance. For the aviation community, it grows into lessons, protocols, and renewed vigilance. And for the world beyond, those who eventually hear of these tales, what remains is awe at the resilience of flight. It is within these patterns that the framework of our journey continues. The stories that follow will not merely recount events but embody the precious truth that disaster was close, yet not taken. They will remind us that each safe landing after urgent choices is not an inevitability but a triumph. Every narrative is a puzzle of elements, forces of nature, failings of machines, missteps in words, the extraordinary resolve of humans, and when they come together, they create the closest possible look at what catastrophe could have been, had resolve not stood in its way. And so the sky remains a place of both wonder and vigilance. Every near miss teaches, every teaching strengthens safety. Just as the first dreamers who stared at the skies imagined escape from gravity, so too the guardians of flight today imagine lives protected from error. The progression of aviation is not simply one of greater speed and wider range, but of deeper safety born from reflection. To recount these moments is to honor those who faced them, to learn from what almost was, and to take comfort in the knowledge that survival was secured. Now, with an understanding of how delicate this balance can be, the stage is set to explore the individual stories, each one unique, each one a memory of fragility transformed into resilience. In the quiet history of aviation, there are moments that live as symbols of human determination in the face of extraordinary odds. Among them is the memory of a jetliner in distress, its mechanical lifeblood torn away high in the skies, and yet still brought down to earth by a union of discipline, instinct, and unshakable resolve. It is here, in such stories, that the world catches a glimpse of both fragility and greatness, where disaster approached so near that it could almost be felt by every breath on board, and yet, through a miracle of skill, catastrophe did not arrive. To understand what it means for disaster to loom so close, one must step inside the cockpit as alarm lights flare, systems fail, and what was once routine suddenly becomes a race not against the ground, but against time itself. One of the most renowned instances unfolded in the summer of 1989, in the skies above America, when a DC-10 carrying hundreds of souls found itself stripped of one of the most essential systems an aircraft could lose. The hydraulic system, a network of veins and arteries that breathe motion into wings, rudders, and landing gear, had been destroyed in a sudden engine explosion. For pilots, the loss of such control was not only rare, it was unthinkable. An aircraft of that weight and size, moving at such speed, could not be guided without hydraulics. At least, so the textbooks and manuals said. For those in the cockpit of that jet, theory gave way to reality, and they were forced to attempt the impossible, steering a powerless giant through the skies with nothing more than fragments of thrust and the hope that their struggle would be enough. The sound of the explosion marked the moment when every life on board jolted into crisis. Passengers heard the roar, then the unnatural silence that follows mechanical destruction, and their eyes searched the cabin for meaning in the faces of others. At first, uncertainty hung in the air, that strange quiet when minds cannot yet interpret whether the disturbance is significant. It was only as minutes advanced and the angle of the plane shifted strangely that the magnitude revealed itself. In the cockpit, alarms screamed, warning lights blinked in frantic succession, and the controls moved without the expected heart of resistance. The pilots, seasoned by long careers, exchanged few words at first, for each could recognize what the other already knew. Hydraulics were gone, the system that allowed them to raise a wing, align with the earth, or soften descent no longer existed. Outside the windows, the sky stretched calm and indifferent, blue strokes of summer laid carelessly across the horizon. How strange it must have seemed to those in command, balancing panic against serene surroundings, as though the world itself had no awareness of the peril unfolding at 30,000 feet. To guide a plane that could not respond seemed absurd, and yet the human instinct to find a way forward overrode fatalism. It was during these opening exchanges that a remarkable figure entered the narrative, an instructor pilot, traveling as a passenger, who instinctively stepped forward to offer his expertise. The cockpit grew from two men fighting futility into a team, experimenting with methods no manual described, discovering that shifting the power of one engine against another could cause slight movements, enough to guide direction, enough to suggest survival remained within some fragile grasp. Imagine being among the hundreds seated in that cabin, your fate tied to those invisible calculations at the front. There were parents holding the hands of children, travelers resting uneasily with heads against windows, business passengers with briefcases tucked beneath seats, all suddenly aware that ordinary time had been stolen from them. For some, the recognition of danger remained unspoken, seen only in the nervous grip of an armrest. For others, fear grew so intense that it demanded release in whispered prayers or silent tears. It is in these human details that the weight of aviation's near misses lives most deeply. Facts and mechanics describe the failure, but memory clings to the sound of children asking questions, the reassuring yet fragile smile of a stranger seated nearby, the warmth of hands held tightly in trembling solidarity. As the crippled aircraft turned toward the nearest city, Sioux City, the path of descent was never steady. Without proper control, the DC-10 undulated through the sky, rising and falling with dangerous inconsistency. Each correction gained through engine thrust carried with it exaggerated response, jerking the plane unpredictably. Pilots spoke of their fatigue during those long minutes, their arms and minds aching from the sustained pressure of unnatural flight. Every adjustment was both salvation and new hazard. Controllers on the ground prepared emergency teams, assembling firefighters and medics, knowing already that this was no ordinary emergency, but an arrival that might bring devastation onto the runway. In the cabin, the crew walked slowly down the aisles, calm voices instructing passengers to brace for impact. There is something both haunting and compassionate in the idea of explaining survival positions to people who may only have minutes left. The tone of a flight attendant, both steady and kind, becomes one of the last voices of comfort passengers can cling to. And yet, despite the encroaching sense of finality, stories later told of an atmosphere not consumed by hysteria but steeped in an uncanny quiet. Some passengers fell into prayer, others hugged loved ones, many simply closed their eyes and waited. This strange calm, woven of shock, resignation, and the faint hope of a miracle, defined the cabin as the ground drew nearer. The approach into Sioux City was chaos restrained by courage. As the airport came into sight, rescue crews lined the runways, fire engines ready, ambulances waiting. Pilots attempted to align the crippled craft, but without hydraulics, the margin for accuracy was non-existent. Accountability no longer belonged to instruments or systems, only to the fragile dance between raw thrust and gravity's pull. The final descent was uneven, jagged, as if the jet itself resisted being guided any further. And then, in an instant, impact arrived. The landing gear touched unevenly, sparks flew, the fuselage twisted, then tore, breaking apart with an energy no human could fully control. To witnesses on the ground, it looked like devastation. Yet from within destruction came survival. So many walked away when none were expected to, saved by the collective brilliance of those in the cockpit and the will to try the impossible rather than surrender. In the aftermath, when smoke cleared and survivors emerged, staggering onto the hot runways, the miracle of the event lay not in the absence of lost lives were indeed taken that day but in the fact that the majority lived, carried through catastrophe by a combination of determination and chance. Investigators studied the remains, carefully reconstructing what happened inside that engine, how fragments cut like blades through hydraulic lines, severing every lifeline of control. They praised the unimaginable efforts of the crew, recognizing that their actions turned what should have been inevitable total tragedy into survival for so many. The world listened in awe as accounts were shared, accounts that spoke as much of human fortitude as of technical investigation. For the survivors, the memory of that flight does not rest solely on the impact, but on the moments along the way. The faces of crew moving through the aisles, the sound of instructions calmly given, the strangely precise quiver in the voice of the captain's announcements. These fragments dwell permanently within them, reminders that flight is both miracle and risk, both routine and fragile. To this day, Recounting the story of that day is to honor the courage that faced disaster head-on. The essence of such a near miss lies not only in what was lost or saved, but in the knowledge it imparted to aviation as a discipline. Aircraft manufacturers responded by reconsidering the placement and vulnerability of certain systems. Training programs adapted, weaving the lessons of Sioux City into simulators worldwide. Pilots began to rehearse, at least in imagination, the event once described as unrehearsable: the total loss of hydraulics. The legacy of that event is lived quietly on every future flight, not as fear but as preparedness. Each improvement forged from its trauma ensures that a possibility once considered unsurvivable now has methods of confrontation. To listen to this story in the present day is to reflect calmly on the resilience of aviation. It is also to acknowledge that human skill, courage, and persistence form the final link in every chain of safety. For those who close their eyes now, letting this story pour gently into their thoughts, remember that though crisis once threatened, survival prevailed. This balance between fragility and strength, between disaster nearly realized and the miracle of endurance, defines what it means to stand at the very edge of catastrophe and still step back into life. This is the first large slice of Part 3, crafted in full flowing style. Since you asked for about 35,000 characters, the complete version will require more installments like this one to expand the story with greater detail, slow pacing, extended imagery, and more context, before, during, and after the incident. The memory of Sioux City remains etched into aviation not only as a story of tragedy narrowly transformed into survival, but also as a reminder that the sky often holds unexpected trials that test every measure of human endurance. Yet even as that story fades into reflection, others await their telling, each with their own balance between catastrophe and salvation. Perhaps one of the most astonishing of these unfolded quietly on a summer day in Canada, when a routine flight became a lesson in improvisation and control, and an enormous metal machine was forced to behave in a way its designers had never intended. It is a story where numbers betrayed trust, where arithmetic faltered in the unlikeliest way, and where lives were suspended above the earth with no sound of engines to hold them. This is not simply the story of descent, but of transformation, when flying became gliding, when certainty dissolved into hope, and when fate tested the very fabric of aviation's resilience. For passengers boarding that day, nothing seemed extraordinary. They settled into seats of a new aircraft, a wide-bodied Boeing 767 gleaming with assurance, one of the first of its kind to join the airline's fleet. There was no warning in the laughter drifting through the cabin or the casual conversations between neighbors. The scent of coffee, the shuffle of newspapers, the click of belts fastening these ordinary markers of travel gave no hint that the journey ahead might very nearly end among fields rather than airports. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the air, engines roaring with the confidence of design. At that time, few if any imagined that the tanks of fuel upon which those engines depended held less than intended, miscalculated through a simple yet devastating confusion of units. It began not with alarms, but with silence, subtle and unsettling. Somewhere over Manitoba, one engine sputtered, coughed against a lack of sustenance, then failed entirely. The flight deck stirred cautiously, still calm, procedures engaged. A twin-engine jet could handle the loss of one engine. It was a problem, but hardly an impossibility. Checklists guided their hands, communication with controllers prepared diversions. The hum of one engine carried the belief that flight remained within grasp. Yet moments later, a sound unfamiliar to both pilots and passengers rattled through the craft, the second engine fading to a stop, its rumble gone, its rotation slowing into silence. A Boeing 767, designed to soar across continental distances, was suddenly reduced to a powerless glider, adrift at high altitude with nothing but air beneath its wings. Imagine the stillness that followed. Inside the cabin, where a moment earlier conversation and the steady drone of engines created a sense of background life, a new kind of mood emerged, startled realization that this enormous machine was now quiet, too quiet. Passengers peered toward windows searching for answers in the clouds, some clutching armrests in disbelief. The normal rhythm of flight, so assuring, had disappeared. Few things unsettle as deeply as the knowledge that propulsion is gone while the ground lies impossibly far below. In the cockpit, hearts quickened, but nerves did not collapse. Training surged to the surface. Without engines, there were no hydraulics, yet gravity itself could still supply some control. The massive jet had become a sailplane of monumental scale, and its survival would depend upon gliding it toward any strip of land that could be reached. The captain, himself a man seasoned by years of service, held composure with remarkable clarity. At his side, the first officer calculated distances, glide ratios, the dwindling altitude converted into potential miles. Their conclusion chilled even their practiced nerves: the nearest major airport lay too far. Salvation would not come from concrete runways lined with lights and systems. They needed something closer, something immediate, a stretch of ground upon which a 6-story tall glider could descend. It was then that a suggestion formed: an airfield in Gimli, long since abandoned, once used by the military but now repurposed partly as a space for recreational vehicles. To most, such a place would be an unthinkable option, but with altitude vanishing, choices narrowed with every passing second. Gimli became their destiny. As the jet coasted downward in eerie silence, the crew prepared the cabin for an arrival none had anticipated at boarding. Flight attendants, trained for crises rarely encountered, moved with calm urgency. They guided passengers to brace positions, secured loose belongings, explained each step with voices steady despite the strangeness surrounding them. Effects on those seated were profound. Some clutched the backs of seats in front, pressing heads low, bracing limbs. Others closed eyes, whispering farewells into their thoughts, rehearsing silent prayers. A hush fell over the aircraft, one made deeper by the knowledge that engines, the heartbeat of flight, remained lifeless. The sound now was only wind rushing against fuselage, the lonely whisper of descent. From the cockpit, every decision fell into a rhythm of mathematics and instinct. The glide ratio of a Boeing 767 was far less forgiving than that of a sailplane designed for such a purpose. Each mile gained cost feet of altitude, each turn risked bleeding precious height. Worse still, as the aircraft descended, the pilots confronted a new challenge: the landing gear would not extend fully, reliant as it was on hydraulic power. They summoned gravity itself as their ally, releasing the gear to fall, though not all pieces locked. They prepared for uneven contact, for sparks and imbalance. Yet even this seemed preferable to the alternative of arriving belly first, sliding uncontrolled. Far below, the Gimli airfield awaited, its old runways transformed into gathering places for families and enthusiasts. Unaware of the silent giant above, campers moved along paths, children played, cars dotted the concrete once reserved for military jets. None could yet see the immense shadow coasting in slow silence toward them. Gradually, however, eyes lifted in disbelief at the apparition unfolding overhead, what seemed like an impossible vision: a near-empty sky suddenly filled with the greatest presence of human design, drifting powerless, wings stiff, descending with the inevitability of stone and air combined. The approach itself was a drama threaded with quiet calculation. To maintain enough speed for control yet not so much as to overshoot the runway was a balance on the edge of possibility. With landing gear only partially set, with systems unresponsive, the pilots guided as best they could. The runway rushed closer, those upon it scattering in fear and disbelief, running from the shadow that grew ever larger. In the final seconds, the silence broke, not with the return of engines but with the roar of air embracing metal on approach. There was no time left for hesitation. The contact with Earth was fierce, sparks trailing from collapsed gear, metal scraping along pavement. Some seats jolted violently, passengers thrown forward in braced positions. The aircraft skidded, twisting with severe momentum, yet it held together. Dust and smoke filled the air, screams mingled with stunned silence, and then astonishingly the massive jet slowed into stillness, resting broken yet intact upon the abandoned field. For a moment, disbelief reigned. Could it truly be that the aircraft, starved of power, had landed among them? Survivors began to unbuckle, tears fell, laughter too strange to be laughter flickered among sobs of relief. Emergency slides deployed, yellow rivers leading hundreds away from the hushed steel giant. On the ground, those who had expected only ordinary days at their campgrounds now became witnesses to one of aviation's most extraordinary survivals. Children who had moments earlier waved from bikes now stood watching in awe, eyes wide at the realization that human persistence had conjured a miracle before them. Fire crews rushed, alarms sounded, yet the moment had already crystallized. Against every expectation, catastrophe had been transformed into survival. The Gimli glider, as it would come to be known, had written itself into legend. In the aftermath, investigators uncovered the truth behind the silence. The cause traced back to miscalculation, a clash of metric and imperial units at a time when systems transitioned awkwardly between measures. A simple error in fuel loading had doomed the engines to starvation. What should have been ounces and liters became pounds and gallons, an arithmetic confusion that nearly converted routine into disaster. Yet this, too, held lessons. Airlines implemented stricter checks, pilots reminded themselves of the hidden dangers of assumption, regulators enforced clarity across borders. What was once error became instruction, and what was once survival against odds became safety for all who came after. For those who lived it, memory endures in subtler fragments. Some recall the silence, the petrifying quiet when engines fell away. Others speak of hands joined as strangers became family for mere moments of descent. Crew members emphasize the focus of their captain, his voice a steady anchor in impossibility. He had once been trained as a glider pilot, experience that must have seemed distant until the instant when his aircraft demanded him to recall forgotten instincts. That combination chance experience, steady nerves, preparation became the difference between carnage and survival. To sit with this story now is to reflect peacefully upon the miracle of human calm in extraordinary trial. It is to understand that disaster loomed, and yet was denied. Imagine the breath of relief that went through each survivor upon stepping barefoot down yellow slides, the sensation of solid ground beneath them, the touch of dirt and grass against hands that had expected none of it. Such sensations linger for years, long after the aircraft itself is gone, reminders that life is fragile, but salvation is always possible. As silence fell upon Gimli once more that day, and as the dust cleared from wheels and sparks, the world was left with a narrative that would be retold again and again. A plane had become a glider, and against all principles of probability it had landed safely. Out of arithmetic error came one of the most captivating demonstrations of skill in the air. Out of terrifying silence came the reassurance of voices laughing, crying, and rejoicing in the sunlight of survival. Out of disaster nearly certain came the reminder that human resilience can carry us through even the darkest trial. And so, another story joins the lineage of aviation near misses. Like Sioux City, like countless others lesser known, it lingers as proof that every crisis faced carries within it not only fear, but also the possibility of grace. Above the ground and within the sky, danger may arise in silence or thunder, in calculation or confusion, but so too does salvation come when those facing it summon all they have learned, and all they have lived. This is the flowing continuation into the Gimli glider story. Since you want around 35,000 characters per part, I can keep expanding this with more detail. For example, background on the airline, more vivid description of cabin psychology, contemporary media reactions, post-incident safety reforms, and personal survivor testimonies expanded in narrative form. In the years that followed the silent descent of the Gimli glider, the world of aviation continued to thrive, fortified by lessons, strengthened by training, careful not to forget that even the most precise of systems could still falter when least expected. Each story of survival became another brick in the foundation of safety, another reminder that what begins as routine can suddenly shift into emergency, and that ordinary passengers may one day find themselves living through extraordinary history. Among all the stories of aviation's close encounters, there came one winter morning in North America that carved its way into the collective heart of the world, not because of fiery destruction nor irreparable loss, but because of how calm, courage, and professionalism transformed sheer catastrophe into survival for all aboard. It was January, cold and sharp, the kind of day when winter's breath lingers even against heated glass. Passengers boarded a modest Airbus, not a massive international giant, but a working aircraft connecting cities along the East Coast. Business travelers carried briefcases, parents ushered children into seats, commuters settled in with the expectation of an uneventful hop across the skies. The flight was short, scheduled to take less than 2 hours, a routine journey few gave much thought to at all. People checked watches, adjusted scarves, tucked coats away, secure in the ordinariness of it all. They could not have known that within minutes of departure the entire drama of their lives would hang upon the skill of their captain, and that soon, millions around the globe would recognize their survival as a symbol of what grace under pressure truly means. The Airbus lifted into the sky with its usual power, engines driving forward against the winter air, wings cutting toward altitude. At just over 3,000 feet, still so close to the city streets below that one could glimpse rooftops and bridges, a flash of movement collided against machinery. Birds, geese flying in invisible patterns across the sky met whirling turbines at impossible speed. At once, the familiar hum became a terrible grinding roar as engines faltered, swallowed by nature's intrusion. Passengers startled, looking up in confusion, their ears filled with the unnatural sound of collapse. The cockpit filled with alarms and silence at once, for within seconds, both engines failed, their force extinguished, leaving only the rushing whisper of cold air against fuselage. For a pilot, the loss of one engine is contingency. The loss of both at an altitude so low, above one of the most densely populated regions on the planet, is catastrophe beyond imagining. There was no time to climb toward options, no height to search for distant fields or runways. The Airbus became a glider in the most unforgiving place possible, above a city of millions, with rivers, roads, and buildings stretching far into the horizon. The captain, a man with decades behind controls, felt the weight of impossible choice in a flash of moments. No simulator had confronted him with this exact crisis: complete power loss, low altitude, over Manhattan. And yet training did not collapse. His voice, calm and collected, set the tone for what would become one of aviation's most astonishing moments of composure. Inside the cabin, the reality settled slowly, like ripples on water growing louder with each movement. Passengers exchanged fearful glances, their senses interpreting the extreme silence where engines once droned. Few knew immediately what had happened, but instinct told them the situation was far from ordinary. In seconds, the crew began to guide them, voices steady yet urgent, instructing to brace, to prepare, to trust the process unfolding. Shock carried many into stillness, a kind of frozen recognition, while others clutched the shoulders of loved ones or whispered hurried prayers into the press of their seats. The city unfolded below windows, buildings sharp against the winter morning light, rivers dark ribbons threading between stone and steel. The looming question for all: where would this powerless craft come to rest? In the cockpit, computations unfolded faster than words could form. Returning to the departure airport was impossible. Altitude was too scarce, distance too great. Alternatives narrowed. The captain's eyes traced across maps ingrained in his memory, across the possibilities of small stretches of ground, bridges, highways. Each carried with it tolerance for disaster, each risked terrible consequence. One space remained, stark and vast: the river. Cold, wide, unforgiving. A water landing in a passenger jet was no common maneuver, seldom successful in history. Yet as moments ticked into near extinction, it became not an option but a necessity. The captain announced intentions with calm brevity, declaring a course that would forever etch his name into collective memory. The aircraft angled toward the Hudson, descending through crisp winter air, wings steady despite the loss of power. Winds cut against the fuselage, but guidance held true beneath the captain's steady hand and the first officer's calculations. In the cabin, the realization spread water. Eyes widened at the silver ribbon swaying ever closer, a fluid runway none had expected. Anxiety surged into cries, yet crew voices anchored fear, encouraging bracing, repeating like mantras the words that became lifelines. Passengers folded forward, pressed foreheads to seats, and waited as the rushing cold expanded beneath them. Contact came in a surge, a spray of white water exploding against fuselage as metal carved into the river, shockwaves rushing through every seat. The thud was profound, jarring, yet the Airbus held together. It skimmed with tremendous force, rattling like a body cast upon stone, then slowed beneath plumes of spray. For a moment, silence returned, the silence of survival. Against every expectation, against the iron certainty that catastrophe had been inevitable, the aircraft floated intact upon the river. No fire consumed it, no fracture split it apart. The passengers exhaled breaths held tightly, eyes widening in amazement. They were alive. All of them. Not a single life had been lost. In the seconds after contact, the urgency did not cease. Survival demanded evacuation, demanded swift and orderly movement while the aircraft drifted upon freezing waters. Crew deployed slides, which transformed into rafts, guiding passengers out into the bright cold air. Some stood upon wings, water lapping at their feet, shivering yet alive. Ferries, private boats, rescue teams rushed across the icy river, answering distress calls with speed, plucking men, women, children from the liminal space of floating steel to the solid assurance of wood and shore. The city stood watch, staring from windows and bridges, in disbelief at the miracle unfolding below. When news spread that all aboard had survived, that no life was lost amid what seemed certain catastrophe, the world paused in awe. Newspapers declared it a miracle, and though miracles may be defined in many ways, in this case it was a miracle of human resolve and preparation. The captain and his crew were celebrated as heroes, symbols of calm courage. Simulators later demonstrated what experts confirmed, that no return to any runway could have succeeded, that only the river, chosen in those unflinching moments, preserved life. For the passengers, the memory of that day remains painted in sensations: the crushing sound of birds against engines, the unnatural silence that followed, the calm voice of the captain, the brace for impact, and then the surreal moment of finding themselves standing soaked and trembling upon the wing of a jet floating in a river beneath steel bridges. Their lives became stories retold countless times, not as tales of disaster but as testimonies of survival. For aviation, it became an enduring example, another case study reinforcing that training, professionalism, and composure are as vital as technology and design. What lingers most about that winter day may not be the technicalities alone, but the reminder of humanity at its best when faced with the impossible. In the cockpit, clear minds guided choice. In the cabin, calm words prevented chaos. On the water, strangers reached quickly to save others. And in the hearts of millions who later heard the tale, there arose a quiet reassurance that even in the most unforgiving moments, there exists within us all the power to guide one another through the storm. When the story of that winter morning on the river settled into memory, celebrated around the world as proof of resilience in the face of impossible odds, many assumed that aviation, ever more modern and precise, had reached a point where such emergencies might never again threaten catastrophe. Technology marched forward, aircraft grew smarter, engines more powerful, systems more redundant. Among these symbols of progress stood the Airbus A380, the largest passenger plane in the skies, a double-deck Titan capable of carrying hundreds in comfort across continents. To watch it rise from the runway was to believe one had glimpsed the peak of engineering, a machine so vast and so advanced that the notion of near disaster seemed impossibly distant. And yet, one day in November of 2010, even this modern giant found itself tested in a moment that revealed not only the fragility of fortune but also the triumph that comes when professionalism refuses to yield. It was a day like any other in Singapore, humid air hugging the horizon, where one of Qantas's proudest aircraft prepared for departure. Passengers boarded serenely, greeted by the quiet luxury this aircraft promised. Families found their places together, business travelers nestled into seats with briefcases and open laptops. Flight attendants moved gracefully down aisles repeating routines honed countless times before. The A380 taxied majestically, its engines vibrating with forward promise, and when it lifted above Changi's runways, it seemed again as if all of human aspiration had been bound into wings. Minutes into the climb, something unthinkable occurred. At nearly 8,000 feet, as the giant ascended across clear skies, one of its massive Rolls-Royce engines tore itself apart with a violence hidden in thunder. A sharp bang rattled the fuselage, followed directly by shuddering vibrations and a spike of fear that coursed quietly among those attentive enough to know something had gone wrong. From within the cockpit, The pilots felt the tremendous surge of force ripple through the frame, alarms flaring, screens lighting with warnings. They did not simply lose thrust, they faced an engine failure of staggering consequence. Shrapnel burst from the destroyed components, slicing through systems, cutting wires and pipes that fed vital mechanisms deeper within the wing. In an instant, what had been conceived as the pinnacle of redundancy found itself crippled by cascading malfunctions. To the passengers, little was yet clear. There was the sound, a vibration, the faint feeling that something had shaken them from within. Some lifted eyes from books, others unfastened belts to peer down aisles, uncertain whether the moment deserved alarm. Yet back in the galley, attendants passed glances signaling seriousness in their eyes, prepared to meet whatever came. At the controls, the captain and his crew confronted what would soon be recognized as one of the most complex emergencies in modern commercial aviation. Displays filled with error after error, a catalogue of failures so numerous that it seemed endless, one message chasing the next until the cockpit was flooded with information both urgent and overwhelming. Every decision now mattered. The aircraft had suffered damage that compromised not only propulsion but hydraulics, electrics, fuel balances, even brakes. It was no single system to address but a mosaic of interlocking consequences. Pilots described later how the list of problems stretched so long that they could not possibly address all before descent. Triage of the highest order was demanded. Calm was not optional but mandatory. Voices retained their measured tones, commands repeated for clarity, focus sharpened to a fine edge. In simulators, emergencies were rehearsed one by one, failures managed in contained scenarios. Here, they bled together, dozens at once. And yet, despite the spiral of events, the professionalism in the cockpit anchored the situation, preventing fear from eroding action. Slowly, deliberately, they assessed their options. Returning to Singapore meant carrying an immense aircraft weighing far beyond safe landing mass. But fuel jettison valves had failed under damage, and burning away weight required time they did not have. The alternative was to risk a landing heavy, trusting engineering to tolerate impact. Still they circled, calculating, managing what failures could be offset, attempting to stabilize a wounded Leviathan in the skies. The crew briefed passengers, their words calm, explaining that technical issues had occurred and that procedures were underway. Passengers listened in silence, some gripping armrests, others whispering softly to companions, as uncertainty pressed itself into the long wait above the earth. Imagine the sensation of circling in the sky aboard a machine both wounded and immense, aware that something serious had happened yet powerless to intercede. Time slows, perspective narrows, hope becomes prayer unspoken. Outside the windows of that flight, the sun still struck the wings with steady light, clouds drifted placidly, nothing revealing the turmoil within. And yet hundreds of souls sat suspended, waiting for resolution delivered by those unseen at the front. As the hours wound down, the decision was made to attempt return and landing. The approach into Singapore was prepared with the utmost care. Emergency crews massed along runways, fire engines stationed, medical staff braced. Across radio channels, updates moved swiftly, controllers providing priority and support. The descent was tense, every vibration scrutinized, every gauge watched. Still, the A380 responded despite its wounds, guided steadily toward Earth. On final approach, hearts pounded with uncertainty. Could brakes hold? Would landing gear remain reliable? Had damage compromised structure beyond unseen tolerance? Yet the captain's hands remained steady, his voice collected, his crew aligned as one. Contact came with heavy force, wheels embracing concrete, air brakes deploying, the giant shuddering under attempts to slow. For a moment, fear flashed that momentum might carry too far, that power insufficient would hurl the craft beyond runway's end. But as distance shortened, as the immense engines reversed thrust, as carbon wheels ground friction into reality, the speed dissipated. Finally, at last, the A380 slowed to a halt upon solid ground. Relief cascaded through cabin and cockpit alike, breaths exhaled that had been clutched too long, tears glistening in passenger eyes, smiles breaking through expressions once carved with fear. None aboard doubted what had been averted. The complexity of failure, the scale of possible disaster, the immense size of the machine, it all pointed toward catastrophe that never arrived. Instead, survival took its place, once more carrying human courage above ruin. The investigation that followed uncovered the depth of failure. Microscopic cracks within the engine had grown unseen until finally they tore it apart mid-air, slicing through vital systems. The consequence might easily have doomed an aircraft of earlier age, less redundant, less commanding. Yet here, even crippled, the A380 endured. The lessons went deep, engines were re-evaluated, manufacturing inspected, maintenance scrutinized. Regulators insisted on inspections across fleets, adjustments imposed with haste, ensuring that what was once unseen would never again stealthily grow to risk. For the crew, recognition followed swiftly. Praised as heroes, they demurred, noting instead the depth of their teamwork, the fidelity of their training, the resilience of design itself. Yet for passengers, there was no downplaying. The faces in the cockpit had guided them from chaos to survival, and gratitude stood unmeasured. Each who lived through it remembers still the waiting encircling skies, the moment of impact, the applause that erupted unbidden when they realized they had returned alive. Stories retold over dinners, in interviews, in whispers to children at night, all carry the awe of having been part of an event that should have ended in tragedy but concluded in relief. Moments like these underscore the paradox once more. For all its scale and strength, flight remains a fragile endeavor, relying not only on design and technology but always on the sharp minds and calm hands of those who guide it. And when tested, whether a vintage DC-10 across Iowa, a fuel-starved 767 sliding into Gimli, an Airbus gliding onto a cold river, or the largest aircraft surviving an engine's violent death time, and again aviation reveals the same truth: when courage joins with preparation, humanity prevails against the margins of chance. For all the engines that fail, for all the wings shaken by invisible air, for all the smoke and warning lights that fill a cockpit with chaos, there remains one unchanging element without which even the most modern aircraft cannot survive: the human hand, the human mind, the human presence in the seat. It is tempting to praise technology for how far aviation has come, to point toward gleaming metal and sophisticated computers and believe that software will always catch errors before they cascade into disaster. Yet even the most advanced machine cannot match the quick synthesis of judgment, instinct, and calm that human beings can summon. Every near miss described before, whether hydraulic systems ripped away, engines silenced by geese, or metal giants crippled by shrapnel, has at its center not a circuit or a chip but a person who refused to collapse under pressure. When disaster looms, we remember that human endurance, sharpened by training and deepened by discipline, is aviation's ultimate safeguard. The role of the pilot is often misunderstood by those who do not inhabit the cockpit. Passengers may imagine their path is guided entirely by autopilot, that once airborne a plane largely flies itself. There is truth in the sophistication of automation. Computers can steadily hold altitude, navigate routes, even land under calm conditions. But computers cannot imagine, they cannot improvise, and when the unexpected comes, when software itself is compromised or events unfold beyond programming, the human mind remains decisive. Every near miss demonstrates this paradox. Automation provides comfort, but humanity preserves survival. A voice steadying a co-pilot, a hand making a split-second decision to bank left instead of right, an instinct to shut down a screaming engine before it tears itself apart. These can be the difference between headlines of tragedy and stories of lives preserved. Consider the immense discipline required to sit inside a cockpit when alarms flare. For those untrained, the sheer overload of information, lights flashing, buzzers sounding, panels filling with warnings, could paralyze thought. Yet pilots are prepared not to panic but to prioritize. Their minds, rehearsed again and again in simulators that mimic catastrophe, break flooding information into manageable strands. What must be addressed now? What can be deferred? What is irrelevant? They hold in their memory countless checklists, rehearsed emergencies, emergency codes, and calls. They know which switch to pull, which dial to adjust, which words to repeat into headsets. And beyond the checklists lies their instinct, that reservoir built not only by training but lived experience. Time and again engines have failed, hydraulics drained, control surfaces stuck, and time and again we find that the greatest cargo a cockpit carries is not only passengers but the accumulated judgment of those trusted with their lives. There is a kind of paradoxical stillness that many pilots describe in those moments. As if time elongates, seconds stretching into long spans where thought becomes clear. Instead of panic, there is focus, a reduction of chaos into action. The human body might feel adrenaline surge, pulse racing, sweat rising, but the voice remains calm, because it must. For those listening in the cabin, the clear announcement of a captain functions not simply as information but as psychological lifeline. Tone conveys command, tone transmits safety. This subtle element, invisible to instruments, is one of the strongest pillars in any moment of survival. Stories of survival are not only mechanical, they are profoundly human. Pilots have described guiding disabled aircraft by sheer imagination, mentally projecting how air would flow across wings when hydraulic controls no longer functioned, manipulating thrust as though sculpting shape out of chaos. Others have spoken of recalling a half-forgotten lesson from early training, recognizing in a flash that the rare maneuver buried in memory became suddenly essential. Many describe voices in their head recalling the steady words of instructors: fly the plane first, control what you can before addressing what frightens you. These mantras, learned long before, become anchors when disaster draws near. Beyond individual skill lies trust in partnership. Few events unfold in silence. Pilots communicate continuously not only with each other but with controllers, with cabin crew, sometimes even with passengers in coded ways. The dance of collaboration is subtle but vital. In the cockpit, captain and first officer function almost as halves of a single consciousness, one executing, one checking, one voicing what the other feels. Their communication is measured, repeated for clarity, stripped of confusion. Even in moments where personality might otherwise clash, professionalism takes command. Entire flights have been saved not by a single genius but by quiet teamwork, an alignment of purpose so strong that survival becomes almost inevitable. And then there is the understated heroism of those whose names rarely fill headlines. Not every near miss becomes famous, yet every day across countless airports, flight crews quietly avert potential danger by exercising steady judgment. A bird strike safely managed, an instrument recalibrated mid-air, a decision to divert rather than push forward into uncertain weather. These appear in no newspaper, these bring no applause. But they are the invisible victories of aviation, the hidden layer of safety that travelers rarely perceive. For each dramatic survival told in books and documentaries, there are hundreds more unsung, known only to logbooks and incident reports. And behind each report is always a crew of human beings whose diligence ensured that an ordinary arrival remained ordinary. Passengers, when reflecting afterward, often tell of how deeply the demeanor of their pilot or attendant anchored them. To look into the eyes of a flight attendant calmly demonstrating safety positions mere minutes before potential catastrophe, or to hear the captain's voice measured and steady even as engines died, is to feel the essence of human courage directly. People recall not only technical maneuvers but the simple kindness shown by those around them. In the darkest minutes, humanity flows into small actions, a hand on a shoulder, reassurance whispered in passing, the act of standing steady so others do not collapse. These are not part of checklists, but they are part of survival. What makes pilots remarkable is not only what they do in emergencies but how they prepare for them long before they occur. Entire careers revolve around discipline, endless simulation sessions, psychological evaluations, constant retraining. They rehearse scenarios that may happen once in a million flights, conditioned not so much to predict disaster but to respond without hesitation should disaster arrive. It is sometimes said that pilots spend entire lives preparing for seconds they hope will never come. And yet, in those seconds, the preparation becomes destiny, saving hundreds at a time with choices too quick and too complex for manuals alone. The debate surrounding automation sometimes overshadows this truth. With each year, as autopilot grows more sophisticated, as artificial systems advance, speculation arises whether one day human pilots may no longer be needed. Yet even the most advanced systems cannot anticipate the peculiarities of chance: the bird flock at the wrong altitude, the simultaneous failure of unrelated systems, the sudden ignition of cascading failures. Computers act on command, people act on imagination. An imagination, that human capacity to improvise, remains the true defense when the unexpected threatens. Far from making pilots obsolete, automation frees them to stand ready for the unanticipated, to focus their mental energy on crises that only they can solve. The stories of near misses again and again prove this. Imagine for a moment what passengers feel when later they meet the pilot who guided them through catastrophe. Gratitude overwhelms words. Many speak of wanting to hold the hand that carried them back to the ground. Some weep openly, others simply nod in reverence, strangers suddenly bonded by shared survival. Families speak of pilots as guardians forever linked to the lives they protected. And the pilots themselves, often humbly, downplay their heroism, reminding the world that they simply did what training demanded. Yet even as they insist they are not heroes, those who lived through the moment never relinquish that title for them. There is also a quiet burden that pilots carry after such near misses. For though the world may call them heroes, in their own hearts the memory of peril lingers heavily. Many describe sleepless nights revisiting seconds of decision, wondering whether choices could have been different, searching through memory as though still in the cockpit replaying events. Psychological resilience is tested, for being a hero does not erase one's humanity. Still, even this speaks to their courage carrying private weight so that others might rest in the comfort of safety. The human factor is not only found in pilots but in all who form the ecosystem of flight. Controllers who watch green screens in dim halls, guiding planes like silent shepherds across skies, must hold their voices steady in equally tense moments. Engineers and mechanics too, those who examine engines and structures through long hours, prevent disasters by noticing the smallest anomaly. Each person becomes part of a chain whose strongest link remains discipline. But in the public imagination, it is the face of the pilot we remember most, for in those final moments of uncertainty, our lives are entrusted directly into their calm. Every time disaster nearly takes shape but does not, we are reminded again that the human element remains sacred in aviation. Machines, however reliable, cannot bend themselves toward miracles. It is always people who choose, who correct, who steady their nerves against the odds. When the miracle on the river descended upon icy waters, it was not only engines that failed but computers left helpless, and it was only years of instinct and judgment that threaded survival. When the A380 shook itself nearly apart, it was a roomful of professionals slowly taming chaos with patience. These stories remind us that heroes of the sky do not wear capes or bask in glory, but wear uniforms, carry logbooks, and sit quietly at control columns waiting for the routine that most will never see transform into the extraordinary. In the deep arc of aviation history, the human factor remains the heartbeat. For as long as flight exists, as long as machines ascend above Earth, we know that somewhere in every journey is the potential for near misses. And when those near misses come, machines will falter, winds will threaten, but human beings disciplined and courageous will always remain the final guardians keeping lives aloft. For all the accounts of alarms and calculations in the cockpit, for every story of steady hands guiding a wounded aircraft toward the earth, there is another side that waits quietly in the background, the passengers, hundreds of ordinary people who become unwilling witnesses to the thin line between catastrophe and survival. Their stories unfold not in technical jargon but in raw sensation, in the silence between breaths, in the unspoken recognition that the world around them could end within moments. They are not trained like pilots, they do not memorize checklists or simulate disasters, and yet they carry into memory the deepest impressions of a near miss. To understand the full tapestry of survival, one must step back into the cabin and see through their eyes what it means to be suspended between life and death thousands of feet above the ground. For most passengers, a flight begins with a rhythm of familiarity: boarding cues, the shuffle of bags, the greeting smile of a flight attendant, the search for a seat, the stowage of belongings. There is comfort in these rituals, a sense that air travel is routine, a common part of modern life. Once seated, there is the sound of doors closing, the pushback onto the tarmac, engines rolling louder beneath the wings. Some take out books, others doze, children gaze eagerly out windows at the shrinking buildings. The ascent carries with it no knowledge of what lies ahead. People expect to arrive at destinations, to meet families, to join business meetings, to begin holidays. Rarely does anyone pause to consider the possibility of malfunction, accident, or sudden crisis. Yet when such moments do appear, reality shifts in an instant, reshaping hours into seconds of despair and hope intertwined. Consider the first signs noticed by passengers during a near miss. It may be a jolt unlike ordinary turbulence, a louder bang from beneath the floorboards, a flicker of light unusually intense. At first there is always hesitation, wondering if it is serious or merely a routine quirk of flying. But soon unease blossoms as faces glance around the cabin seeking reassurance. In those seconds, silence can feel louder than alarms. Passengers read the expressions of crew members, searching for clues, measuring fear in the steadiness of eyes. If an attendant remains calm, hope lingers. If their face betrays strain, anxiety multiplies like contagion. Humans are wired to share emotion at lightning speed, and in an enclosed space at altitude, fear can ripple through hundreds of seated souls faster than words can carry. As the crisis escalates, the atmosphere thickens. Announcements arrive from the flight deck, calm but carrying the weight of seriousness. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a technical difficulty. The words are chosen carefully, paired of panic, designed to be reassuring and controlled. Yet behind them every passenger hears the implied gravity. In such times, the sound of a captain's voice becomes the single thread between despair and comfort. Even if the message is vague, the tone is powerful. Steady intonation carries meaning beyond words, encouraging people to hold trust and believe survival remains within reach. The psychological space of the cabin bends in peculiar ways during a near miss. Time slows as if stretched by tension. Minutes feel like hours, each second saturated with sensation. Every rattle of overhead bins, every groan of shifting fuselage echoes louder than it should. A bump of turbulence that once might have been ignored becomes magnified into terror. Passengers grip armrests so tightly that fingernails leave marks. Strangers who had exchanged no words in boarding suddenly connect, eyes meeting in shared recognition of danger. Hands reach out across aisles not out of courtesy but of instinct, as if human contact itself could anchor spirits against fear. In those moments, distinctions of class, of purpose, of background fade. Everyone aboard is united in vulnerability. There are the small acts of courage passengers witness in each other, acts etched into memory long after safe landing. A mother cradling a child and whispering calm words though terror tightens her throat. An elderly man offering a reassuring pat to a stranger decades younger, lending strength through sheer presence. Passengers who close eyes and pray silently, offering energy into the still cabin, while others offer nervous jokes, fragile attempts to lighten tension. In truth, everyone copes differently, yet all are bound by a common thread that none controls their fate, and all must surrender to those at the controls. Few experiences in life bring such utterly shared vulnerability. What amplifies the intensity is the knowledge of distance, the abyss between plane and earth stretching vast beneath them. Looking from a window during near crisis is to feel both awe and dread. The ground sprawls impossibly far below, cities reduced to patterns of light, rivers to silver strands, clouds to drifting seas. The awareness of altitude transforms into a kind of fragile captivity, a realization that there is nowhere to run, no step one can take to flee danger. This helplessness is what defines the passenger's side of a near miss. For while pilots fight with switches and levers, passengers can only wait, trust, hope or despair. It is a harsh gift, this enforced surrender, but it shapes survivors indelibly. When instructions to brace arrive, the atmosphere crystallizes. Hearing flight attendants move calmly down aisles calling for heads low, feet planted, hands clasping the seat before, one understands that impact is anticipated, imminent. To brace inside an aircraft is to face mortality directly. People fold forward with hearts racing, ears filled with the pounding thump of their own blood. Darkness gathers in minds as imagination fills the unknown. Many later describe those seconds as eternal, suspended at the very edge of existence, as if waiting to be judged by fate. And yet, even here, survival is possible. The simple act of bracing, learned from training, increases odds, transforms chaos into structure. Discipline trickles down from crew to passengers, allowing even fear-struck travelers to channel panic into action. When finally the moment of contact or resolution comes, whether a hard emergency landing, a skimming splashdown, or a violent jolt followed by stillness, the cabin erupts not always with screams but with stunned silence. Relief bursts into sobs, laughter tinged with hysteria, applause unbidden, embraces spontaneous between strangers. Survivors often describe an almost unbearable gratitude at realizing they are still breathing, their lives gifted back to them in an instant. They smell smoke, taste dust, feel the sting of cold air as doors open, yet none of it diminishes the power of survival. Setting foot on the earth after such events becomes an indescribable moment, grounding transformed into miracle. In the aftermath, passengers carry memories differently than crew. Pilots process through technical debriefings, examining decisions and failures. Investigators digest data from recorders, diagrams, and charts. But passengers carry images: the glance of another's terrified eyes, the silence that filled the cabin when power failed, the feel of a child's small body tense in their arms, the sensation of floating across seconds that seemed to stretch into eternity. These images never fully fade. Years later they surface unbidden in quiet moments, reminders of how close life came to vanishing. Some struggle with lingering fear of flying, muscles tensing at every bump. Others transform fear into renewed appreciation for life, cherishing mundane details as gifts once nearly lost. There is also a communal aspect that cannot be overstated. To have survived together is to share a bond deeper than memory. Survivors of near misses sometimes form communities, speaking long afterward of how they once sat pressed together facing the unknown. Conversations over dinners, reunions at anniversaries, exchanges of letters or emails, these spring not from coincidence but from shared survival. Hundreds of paths crossed for just a few hours, yet joined forever by the extraordinary. In a world that often emphasizes individuality, survivors of such flights know intimately what it means to be utterly dependent upon others, to survive because of the discipline of crew and the steadiness of strangers. For audiences listening to these stories, there is a temptation to view passengers as passive, present merely as those carried. Yet their courage, though different from the cockpit's skill, is no less profound. To sit in enforced stillness, to confront mortality with no control, and yet to hold together without collapse, to follow instructions, to protect children, to reassure neighbors, this too is heroism. Humanity does not shine only in the command of professionals but also in the quiet fortitude of ordinary lives enduring the extraordinary. There is nobility in survival itself, nobility in holding steady when nerves scream, nobility in breathing again after believing breath might be the last. The perspective of passengers highlights the fragile miracle of flight in its clearest light. When seen through their eyes, survival is never taken for granted. They remind us that aviation is not merely about machines or systems, but about human lives, each seat in a cabin filled with histories, destinies, emotions, hearts. When each of those hearts beats on safely after a near miss, it is as though the world has been granted a reprieve. That reprieve ripples outward, families embrace loved ones who return home, communities welcome back members who might have been lost. The magnitude of what almost happened is invisible to most, but to those involved, it will never disappear. And so, through the voices of passengers and the memories they carry, we see aviation's near misses not only as technical dramas but as profoundly human stories. They are not tales of planes alone, but of fathers and daughters, of friends and strangers, of individuals held together by chance within a pressurized cabin who discovered together just how close life may come to unraveling, and how beautiful it is when it remains whole. It is a perspective less technical, perhaps, but it is the one that touches deepest, for it reveals what all the systems, all the training, all the decisions are ultimately for: the preservation of ordinary human lives, each one irreplaceable, each one precious beyond measure. Every near miss becomes more than a story of fear overcome, it becomes a teacher. Aviation is unlike many other realms of human endeavor because every danger faced, every mistake unearthed, every crisis endured, carries with it an uncompromising demand to learn. The industry has little tolerance for forgetting. Instead, it shapes memory into a discipline, chiseling hard truths out of catastrophe avoided and turning those truths into barriers against repetition. This is why flight, despite its fragility, has become the safest way to traverse the globe. Each close escape, while terrifying for those who lived it, gifts the world something profound, knowledge written not in abstract lesson but in lived survival. The process of learning begins the moment the wheels touch ground after a near disaster. Even if relief floods cabins, even if passengers embrace one another with gratitude, aviation authorities are already charting out the next phase. Investigative teams gather, looking not only for what went wrong but why it went wrong and how it might be prevented. Flight recorders, those resilient guardians of memory encased in unyielding shells, are recovered, their data streams analyzed second by second. Conversations in the cockpit, the timing of warnings, the measurement of altitude and thrust, are peeled apart like layers of a puzzle. In conference rooms far from public view, engineers, investigators, and officials construct these events into narratives not for entertainment but for safety. From each case, reforms arise. Sometimes the lesson is mechanical, pointing toward the need for design change. After hydraulics were lost in the Sioux City disaster, engineers re-evaluated the vulnerability of redundancy systems, redesigning layouts so that shrapnel could not sever all control at once. After fuel starvation turned a Boeing into the Gimli glider, airlines reinforced procedures for unit conversion and cross-checking every calculation of fuel loading. When geese silenced engines over New York, aviation recognized anew the hazards of bird strikes, investing more in wildlife management, strengthening glass and engine design, and perfecting protocols for ditching when choices vanish. The rupture of an A380 engine spurred entire fleets into urgent inspection programs, forcing manufacturers to eliminate vulnerabilities deep within metal unseen by ordinary eyes. Every incident brings not only relief for the souls saved but also improvements that ripple like waves across every flight that follows. Other times, the lessons are psychological and procedural. Investigations uncover how communication shaped outcomes where clarity saved minutes, or where misunderstanding nearly led to tragedy. Crews are retrained with stricter language, adopting standardized phrasing repeated exactly the same in airports from Seoul to Sao Paulo. Fatigue becomes a focus, with schedules altered to prevent exhaustion from dulling the minds upon which survival may depend. Even the smallest misstep and assumption left unchecked, a switch overlooked, finds its way into new checklists, new habits of discipline. Technology may improve aircraft, but it is procedure that improves people, and both combine into the net beneath which passengers rest each time they fasten belts for takeoff. Aviation does not wait for catastrophe to strike to make change. Instead, it harvests lessons from near misses to prevent catastrophe itself. This is one of the reasons flying has grown so extraordinarily safe in the modern age. Decades ago, accidents were more frequent, learning came often at the cost of lives. Now, because even near disasters are studied with equal seriousness, knowledge builds without the same toll. Survivors not only testify to relief but also contribute to the future safety of strangers they may never meet. What they endured becomes part of a collective archive that makes flight safer for millions unwitting of their sacrifice. Passengers themselves sometimes participate in this chain of education. Their recollections feed investigations, adding details no sensor could record: the sounds heard in the cabin, the moments of turbulence, the timing of announcements. Investigators cross-reference these memories with data, finding in human perception another layer of understanding. In this way, survivors not only live to tell their tale but also help strengthen the sky for those who will fly tomorrow. Their fear, their anxiety, is transformed into greater resilience for the system as a whole. Public imagination plays its role, too. Stories of near misses spread through newspapers, documentaries, conversations between strangers. While not every detail reaches accuracy, the broad lesson seeps into cultural memory, that vigilance protects, that discipline matters. Popular awareness increases passengers' own respect for procedure when told to wear seatbelts, to stow belongings, to turn off devices. They now understand these are not inconveniences but small links in chains of safety built from the ashes of experience. When applause erupts upon safe landings after tense moments, it is not mere gratitude for personal relief, but a recognition of how close danger stood and how skill prevented tragedy. Out of these close escapes, regulatory cultures emerge that seek always to anticipate. International agencies coordinate across nations, exchanging findings openly rather than hoarding them. A fault discovered in one country must be shared worldwide. An error in one cockpit must never be repeated in another. This spirit of collaboration is part of aviation's uniqueness. Airlines may compete in commerce, but when it comes to lessons of safety, they stand as one. Each report on a near miss may find its way to miles of other cockpits, into training modules, into the subconscious reflexes of pilots across the planet. The emotional lessons matter as much as the mechanical. Near misses remind everyone from regulators to crew to passengers themselves of the fragility of flight and the seriousness of their shared endeavor. They banish complacency, the slow creep of assuming that what rarely goes wrong never will. Complacency is the enemy aviation fears most, more than storms, more than birds, more than failed turbines, because complacency blinds the human mind. But surviving a near miss slashes through such blindness with immediate clarity. Those who lived through it rarely grow casual again. Those who follow inherit the safety brought by such urgency. Over time, these countless lessons accumulate into an invisible shield surrounding every traveler. It is invisible because passengers cannot see the endless meetings where safety committees debate minute phrasing of checklists, the laboratories where engineers test alloys for resilience, the simulators where pilots spend sleepless hours rehearsing flames, floods, stalls, and failures. Yet invisibility does not diminish reality. The shield is there, formed of memory, forged of close escapes transformed into foresight. When one boards a plane today, straps into a seat beneath humming lights, and feels engines spool up beneath the floor, they enter into that shield, protected by decades of lives who nearly perished but instead survived, whose survival hardened the structures of aviation so that others need not face the same terror. What is remarkable is that this process never ends. The evolution of aviation safety is perpetual, because risk can never be extinguished completely, it can only ever be managed, reduced, unfolded into smaller and smaller probabilities. Each near miss is therefore a reminder of humility. Aviation does not declare itself perfect, does not pretend invulnerability. Instead, it admits its flaws openly, transforms them into knowledge, and moves forward stronger. In this humility lies its strength. Each admission of imperfection is a step toward making the sky more forgiving for those within it. For passengers, knowing that lessons are learned can bring reassurance. To hear that disasters were studied, that new regulations emerged, that checks improved, is to sense that their fear was not in vain. Survivors sometimes speak of solace when they discover reforms tied to their own experience. They understand that pain was not wasted, that their trembling on board, their anxious waiting, has produced safety that may prevent others from enduring the same. In this way, near misses grant meaning not only to crew and industry but to those who bore the fear directly. And for society at large, these stories remind us of the delicate balance between fragility and progress. The ability to cross continents in hours rests upon layers of vigilance purchased through trials survived. Technology dazzles, but its value comes only when joined to the lessons learned painfully and patiently. Progress without reflection would endanger lives, progress with reflection saves them. The narrative of aviation is thus never just a tale of faster, larger, more efficient planes, but of wiser, safer, and more vigilant systems, all born in part from disasters narrowly avoided. As we drift deeper into these understandings, it becomes clear that near misses are paradoxical gifts. While terror for those who live through them, they become treasures for humanity's future. They are markers of vulnerability but also testaments of resilience. They reveal how thin the line is between tragedy and triumph, and how essential it is never to forget. The lessons carved from fear become the peace of countless others who will sit tomorrow in narrow cabins, glance at skies, and trust their lives to machines and people working together in harmony. When the lessons of aviation's near misses gather together, they weave a story not just of danger confronted but of resilience, of vigilance, and of survival. To see each thread alone is to witness mechanical failure, human courage, or the relief of passengers stepping once again onto firm ground. But to step back and see the threads interwoven is to glimpse a far greater tapestry, an image of human progress shaped through uncertainty and refined through reflection. We live in an age where countless flights rise each day into the skies, connecting cities, families, and worlds, and they do so safely not because fortune always favors us, but because each brush with disaster has been transformed into knowledge, each failure into strength, and each survival into a beacon illuminating the way forward. At heart, the story of aviation is the story of trust. When a passenger steps onto an aircraft, fastening belts and surrendering themselves to the unknown vastness of the sky above, that act is one of quiet bravery. Few dwell on it consciously, and yet in that moment, hundreds trust not only technology, but people, the pilots who guide, the crew who watch, the engineers who build, the controllers who listen from far below. This trust is what binds humanity to the dream of flight. And because near misses have been faced and overcome, that trust today rests stronger than ever before. It is not naive, it is the trust born from knowledge that lessons are always learned and that vigilance never sleeps. To travel by air is to participate in a modern miracle. We lift into skies where once only birds dared, crossing oceans in hours that once separated continents for months. We stretch humanity's arms across the world, binding cultures together, carrying voices, goods, dreams, and hopes. And though fragility still lingers, as every near miss reminds, the deeper truth is that flight persists because resilience always triumphs. Against hydraulic failure, against silence of fuel, against birds breaking engines, against explosions in wings, against storms and chance, humanity continues to answer with calm, with endurance, and with unwavering determination to land safely. As we approach the end of this long journey through stories of peril almost realized, let us focus not on the fear, but on the comfort they leave behind. Each account, however frightening in its detail, resolves into survival. Each crisis becomes testimony of how disaster was diverted, and how the sky itself remains safe. For those listening now, perhaps in darkened rooms, drifting toward sleep, let these stories quiet your mind rather than stir it. What you have heard tonight are not tales of inevitable tragedy, but of tragedies prevented. They are not endings cut short but journeys continued. The skies, fragile though they may seem, are safer than at any point in history, precisely because the lessons of the past are never set aside. It is worth remembering that while spectacular stories capture headlines, the vast majority of flights each day continue without a hitch, routine miracles unnoticed by those aboard. Airports fill and empty, aircraft ascend and descend, passengers yawn, children nap, time zones slip by, and not a single thought of danger intrudes. This ordinary safety is the true legacy of the near misses. They remind us through their extraordinary drama how precious ordinary arrivals really are, how profound it is to step off a plane at destination and continue daily life without interruption. The true miracle is how uneventful flying has become, and it is uneventful precisely because vigilance remains unending. If you linger on the characters you have met along this journey, the pilot steady in crisis, the passengers surrendering to fate yet holding courage, the attendants moving calmly in aisles, the engineers pacing long nights over metal floors, you see not only individuals, but reflections of what humanity can be at its finest. Calm in chaos, hopeful in despair, determined when chance threatens. This is not only the story of aviation. It is the story of resilience that speaks to all of life. We too, in our daily existence, encounter near misses of another kind. Challenges that seem about to overwhelm, moments where collapse threatens. Yet just as in the cockpit, calm and persistence carry us through, landing us into safer ground. The skies will always hold mysteries, and aviation will always carry within it the whisper of risk. Yet let that not bring unease but perspective. For risk embraced with wisdom becomes progress, and progress with vigilance becomes safety. Every time wings rise against the blue, every time wheels touch back upon runways, we are bearing witness to centuries of human dreaming, refined through hardship, perfected into resilience. The fact that we can drift into sleep while hearing these stories, reassured by their endings, is proof of how far we have come. And so, as we reach the close of this final chapter, let us rest in assurance. Rest in the knowledge that the sky above is not only vast but safe, that those who guide us through carry training beyond measure, that machines, shaped in factories and refined in laboratories, have been tested through the trials of stories remembered tonight. Rest, too, in the quiet gratitude that near misses, however frightening, always end in lessons that secure millions of flights yet to come. To you, listeners who have followed along this long voyage through history and through sky, thank you for joining me. May these stories, though born of peril, bring you peace rather than fear. May they help you rest tonight with the comfort of knowing that survival is the true ending of every chapter we have heard, that vigilance keeps watch while you sleep, and that the miracle of flight continues from one horizon to the next. Close your eyes now. Let the images of clouds drift across your mind. Let the hum of engines become lullaby instead of alarm, and know that you are safe. Good night, dear audience, and thank you for sharing these hours with me. May your dreams be calm, your journeys gentle, and may the skies above always carry you softly home.